Welcome to In-Silico Trials Real Impact, the In-Silico UK podcast that's revolutionizing the way we think about medical innovation. I'm Professor Loughran G from the University of Manchester, and I'll be your guide through this fascinating world of in-silico technologies. In each episode, we'll dive into cutting-edge research and groundbreaking news that are shaping the future of medical product development and regulation. From computational modeling to simulated clinical trials, we are exploring how digital approaches are transforming healthcare, making it safer, more efficient, more equitable, and incredibly precise. So, whether you're a researcher, regulator, a member of the public, or a patient representative, or simply curious about the future of medicine, tune in as we unravel the complex world of in-silico methods and their real-world impact. Get ready to discover how computer-simulated trials are leading to very real breakthroughs in patient care. In-Silico Trials Real Impact, where algorithms and data are saving lives. Let's begin.
Hey everyone, and welcome back to the Deep Dives. Today we're going deep into the world of medical device design. You ready for this? We're talking spinal implants, but not just any implants. We're going way beyond the operating room and into the world of virtual testing. I know it sounds pretty futuristic, right? But that's what we're unpacking today. We're going straight to the source, a scientific journal called Methods. This research is all about making sure computer models of these implants are, actually reliable enough to base real-world decisions on. Buckle up, because here's where it gets super cool. They're using something called finite element analysis, FEA for short, to simulate how these devices behave under stress. And get this, they do it all without involving actual patients.
It's fascinating, really. This study tackles a very real challenge faced by a spinal device company called ZimV. They wanted to add a small channel called a cannulation to their existing pedicle screws. Those screws are used to stabilize the spine during surgery.
So it's like a tiny tweak to the design, but, even small changes can have big consequences.
Exactly. The cannulation was meant to allow for less invasive surgery, which is obviously great, but they had to be absolutely sure this tiny tweak wouldn't, compromise the strength of the device. Imagine it breaking inside someone's spine. That's where FEA comes in.
Okay, so I'm picturing this virtual world. You can stress test an implant without ever actually having to build it. No operating room, no patients, just pure computational power. It's almost like a crash test, but for spinal implants, and all in the digital realm.
Perfect analogy. Finite element analysis really is like a virtual laboratory. Engineers can apply forces, test different materials, and see exactly how a design holds up under pressure. It's been a game changer for the medical device industry.
Okay, that makes sense. But it's not enough to just create a fancy computer model, right?
Yeah.
How do you know that what happens in the virtual world will actually happen in a real patient's spine?
Absolutely. That's a crucial question. To make sure they weren't just living in a simulation, they didn't just rely on FEA. They also did real-world testing using a standard method called ASTM F1717.
So, a real-world test and a virtual test.
Yeah.
I'm curious, how did the real-world test work? Did they, use real spines for that?
Oh, no, that wouldn't be ethical for this kind of study. Instead, they used a simulated spine made of ultra-high molecular weight polyethylene blocks. Think of them as standings for vertebrae in this, specialized testing apparatus.
Okay, so they've got this simulated spine, and they put these screws through the ringer to see how much force they could handle before breaking.
It's a rigorous test for sure. And to be extra sure their results were reliable, they even conducted the testing in two separate labs, ZimV's own lab and the FDA's labs. Talk about thorough.
2 labs, 2 tests.
Yeah.
And to add even another layer to this, did they create multiple virtual models too?
He did, not just one virtual model. They actually brought in 3 independent labs to build separate FEA models, each using slightly different software and techniques.
Ah, so it's like a triple check system, making sure the results are consistent no matter who builds the model or what software they're using.
Exactly. It's like peer review for the virtual world, ensuring the testing methods are robust and reliable no matter who's doing the testing.
This is all starting to sound like a pretty solid foundation for virtual testing. But I'm still wondering, how do you actually build one of these virtual models in the first place? And more importantly, how do you know it's accurate?
Well, that's where the science comes in. To make sure their models were up to par, they had a 2-pronged approach: verification and validation.
Interesting. Verification and validation, 2 very important steps.
Oh.
Okay, let's break those down. What exactly is verification?
Think of verification like making sure the software itself is working as it should, making sure it's doing the math correctly. They essentially gave the software simple problems with known solutions, like, let's say, simulating a bending beam. Kind of like checking if your calculator is giving you the right answer for 2 plus 2. You want to be sure the software is working as expected before you throw complex simulations at it.
Right, so verification is all about making sure the foundation of your virtual testing is solid.
Got it. Now, what about validation? How do they make sure that virtual model behaves like the real deal?
Validation is where the virtual and real worlds meet. Essentially, you compare the results from your virtual model to the results from real-world tests. You're checking if the virtual spine made in the computer behaves the same way as a physical spine under the same conditions.
So they're cross-referencing the virtual with the real, making sure they match up. Did they just look at whether or not the implant broke? Or do they go deeper and look at the nitty-gritty details?
Oh, they went way beyond a simple pass or fail. They focused on key indicators like stiffness, how much the implant bends under force. They looked at the force needed to cause permanent bending or even damage, and the force at a specific displacement. Wow, so they really captured the full performance profile of the implant, both virtually and in the real world. They're making sure that virtual model isn't just getting lucky with a couple of data points, but accurately reflecting how the implant behaves under a whole range of conditions.
You got it. And they didn't stop at just comparing a few numbers. They did something called a level 2 comparison, which looks at the entire force displacement curve.
Okay, now you've got me curious. What in the world is a force displacement curve? And why is a level 2 comparison so important?
A force displacement curve is basically a graph, right? It shows you how much force is required to move the implant a certain distance. It gives you a really detailed picture of how the implant responds to stress.
So if I'm understanding correctly, a level 1 comparison would be like checking if the implant breaks at the same force in both the virtual and real world tests.
Exactly.
But a level 2 comparison goes deeper.
Right. It looks at the entire shape of the curve, not just a single point. It even takes into account uncertainties in the measurements. You want to make sure the model isn't just accidentally matching the real-world results at a few points, but truly capturing the overall behavior of the implant.
That makes a lot more sense. So it's like the difference between checking if two cars can both go 60 miles per hour and comparing their entire acceleration profiles, how smoothly they speed up and all that. Level 2 is like a much more detailed analysis.
Absolutely. And it's really important for building trust in these virtual testing methods.
All right, so they've put these virtual models through rigorous verification and 2 levels of validation. What was the verdict? Did the virtual models pass the test?
Drum roll, please. They did. All 3 virtual models accurately predicted how the pedicle screw system would behave under the real-world conditions.
So the virtual world matched up with the real world. That's a huge win for virtual testing.
It is. This gives us a strong indication that FEA can be a powerful and reliable tool for this type of design evaluation. It's almost like having a crystal ball, You can see how your design will perform in the real world before you even build it.
That's pretty amazing. Okay, so we've got this incredible virtual testing ground, and we know it works. But remember, the whole point of this study was to see if adding that small channel, the cannulation, would weaken the screw.
Yeah.
So what did they do next?
This is where the real power of FEA comes in. They took that validated model of the original screw and virtually added the cannulation.
So they're basically like performing virtual surgery on a virtual screw.
Yeah, exactly. And then they ran the same virtual tests on this new design.
So they didn't have to go through the whole process of actually making these cannulated screws just to test them out. They could just try it out and see if it worked in the virtual world first.
Precisely. And that's a huge advantage of FEA. It allows for this rapid prototyping and testing in a way that you just couldn't do with traditional methods. You can go through, dozens, even hundreds of different design variations virtually before you even think about creating a physical prototype.
That's got to save so much time and money, right? Being able to test things out virtually like that.
Absolutely. Okay, so they ran the simulations. What happened? Did adding that channel make the screw weaker?
Yeah, tell us, did it work?
Well, here's the exciting part. Adding the cannulation had a really minimal impact on how the screw performed. The differences in things like stiffness and the force needed to make it yield, those were less than 5% between the original and the cannulated design.
Wow, less than 5%. So it seems like they found this sweet spot, a design that allows for a less invasive surgery but without messing with the strength of the implant. It's a win-win, right?
Absolutely. But, there's always a but in science.
Oh, there's always a but. What is it this time?
Well, it's not so much a gotcha as just a reminder that, models are models. They're not reality, right? They're representations. And that means there's always going to be some uncertainty.
Okay, that makes sense.
Yeah.
But they validated these models, didn't they? They compared them to the real world. Didn't that get rid of the uncertainty?
Validation is definitely super important. It does help to reduce a lot of that uncertainty, but it doesn't completely eliminate it. There are always going to be these factors that we can't perfectly control or predict. Things like tiny variations in the materials, how they're manufactured, or even just the way the tests are done. Those can all introduce a little bit of imprecision.
So it's like that old saying, measure twice, cut once. But in this case, it's more like measure 1,000 times, simulate 1,000,000 times, and then maybe you'll have a decent idea of what's going on.
Yeah, something like that. And, to their credit, the researchers in this study, they didn't try to ignore that uncertainty. They actually tried to measure it. They used something called Monte Carlo simulation, which is basically running the simulation a whole bunch of times, each time with slightly different inputs.
Monte Carlo simulation. That sounds fancy. What is that exactly?
Okay, imagine you're baking a cake and the recipe says 1 cup of flour. But let's be real, nobody measures out exactly 1 cup every time, right? Sometimes you might add a little more, sometimes a little less.
Yeah, there's always going to be a little variation, even if you're trying to be super precise.
Exactly. That's where Monte Carlo simulation comes in. Instead of running the simulation once with these perfect values, you run it tons of times, each time tweaking the inputs a little bit to see how much the results change.
So it's like you're baking that cake 100 times, each time with slightly different amounts of flour, to see how it affects the final product. Some might be a little more dense, some more fluffy, but you get an idea of the range of what's possible.
Precisely. So in this case, the researchers used Monte Carlo simulation to look at how things like uncertainties in the materials or the loading conditions might affect the performance of that cannulated screw design.
So it's not just saying, hey, this is the answer. It's more like, here's the range of possible answers, and we're taking into account the uncertainty that's always there.
Right. And that kind of transparency and rigor is what makes us really confident in these findings. They didn't just ignore the uncertainty, they actually included it in the analysis.
That's definitely reassuring. So what's the big takeaway from this whole study? What does it tell us about the future of designing medical devices?
I think this study shows us just how powerful finite element analysis can be for medical devices. It allows for that rapid prototyping, virtual testing, and design refinement, all things that just weren't possible before. It could really speed up the pace of innovation, make things less expensive, and lead to safer and more effective treatments for patients.
That's pretty exciting. Yeah. But it's not just about the technology itself, right? It's about having that rigorous testing process, making sure these virtual models are actually reflecting the real world. That's what gives us confidence that virtual testing can be used to make real decisions that could affect patients' lives.
Exactly. It's not just about making fancy simulations. It's about making simulations we can trust. That requires a deep understanding of how things work, a commitment to doing those rigorous tests, and a healthy amount of skepticism, always questioning and double-checking.
Okay, so we know this virtual testing approach works for spinal implants. But what about other things? Could it be used to design other types of medical devices? What about things outside of healthcare?
Absolutely. The potential is huge. FEA is already used to design so many things, like airplanes and cars, bridges, even buildings. And in the medical field, it's everywhere. Artificial joints, heart valves, you name it, they're probably using FEA to design it.
So it's like this super versatile tool that you can use for all sorts of things. That's pretty cool.
Yeah.
What do you think the future holds for FEA? Are there any exciting advancements coming up?
One thing that's really interesting is how they're starting to use AI and machine learning in FEA models. It could make the simulations so much more accurate and efficient, which would let engineers explore even more complex designs, really push the boundaries.
So instead of just having fixed values for things like material properties, the software could actually learn and adapt based on real-world data, right? It's like the model is constantly getting smarter and more accurate.
Yeah, exactly. And that's just one example. There's so much happening. We're seeing all these new materials and manufacturing techniques that are changing what's possible with implants, like things that are lighter, stronger, last longer, and are even more compatible with the body. 3D printing is huge right now, and there's a lot of work being done with biocompatible materials that can be tailored to each patient.
It's not just about simulating what we already have. It's about using FEA to come up with totally new ideas, to create things we couldn't even imagine before. That's amazing.
It really is. It's like virtual testing is opening up all these new doors for us in healthcare.
Well, we've covered a lot of ground today. From the challenges of designing medical devices to the ins and outs of virtual testing, what's the main takeaway you'd want our listeners to remember?
I think the biggest takeaway is that virtual testing is revolutionizing medical device design. It's allowing us to create treatments that are safer, more effective, and more personalized. And as the technology keeps getting better, we're going to see even more amazing breakthroughs in the years to come.
That's an inspiring thought. We've seen how computer simulations aren't just tools for engineers. They're helping to drive innovation and make healthcare better for everyone. All right, everyone, that wraps up our deep dive into the world of virtual testing in medical device design. We've explored how computer models can recreate real-world conditions, how rigorous validation makes sure those models are reliable, and how all of this is leading to surgeries that are safer, more efficient, and less invasive. So next time you hear about a cool new medical device or a groundbreaking design, remember the power of virtual testing and all the amazing scientists and engineers who are making it happen. They're the ones pushing the limits of what's possible in healthcare. That's all for today, folks. Thanks for tuning in to the Deep Dive. Until next time, keep exploring and keep diving deep.